What if I told you, some spirits never left their graves, and tonight, they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video, so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming.
The night the sky fell. The night sky over Florida had always been a velvet dome of stars, scattered like the memories of sailors lost at sea. But on December 29, 1972, the stars seemed oddly indifferent, their light remote and cold as a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, named Whisperjet, descended toward Miami International Airport. Flight 401 had been routine, a late-night run from New York City, carrying 163 souls through the dark winter sky. The passengers were tired, some half asleep, some sipping the last of their coffee, unaware that history was waiting just beneath them in the black waters of the Everglades. Captain Robert Loft sat calmly in the left seat, a man whose entire career had been about precision, order, and control. He was tall, weathered by years of flying, a steady hand on the yoke. Beside him, First Officer Albert Stockstill, Bert to his friends, scanned the instruments with quiet confidence. Behind them, in the jump seat, sat Flight Engineer Donald Repo, who had the warm kind of smile that made passengers trust him instinctively. The Whisperjet hummed like a lullaby, its 3 Rolls-Royce engines purring. It was considered one of the safest aircraft in the sky, a marvel of modern engineering, a machine meant to banish the idea of air disasters from the collective mind. And yet, in the heart of that December night, something small and unremarkable happened. A nose gear indicator light failed to illuminate. It was such a trivial thing at first. Loft frowned, tapped the indicator, then ordered Stockstill to cycle the gear. Nothing. The light stayed dark. A single $20 bulb had just shifted the flight crew's attention away from the sky. Miami. Approach cleared them to hold at 2,000 feet while they figured it out. The autopilot kept the jet steady as Loft turned to Repo. "See if that nose gear's really on," he said. Repo unstrapped and disappeared beneath the cockpit floor through a narrow hatch into the avionics bay, the hellhole, as crews called it, to get a visual on the gear. Through a tiny porthole, up in the cockpit, Stockstill accidentally nudged the control column as he tried to help, and in a small, almost imperceptible motion, the autopilot switched from altitude hold to control wheel steering. The jet began to descend, slowly, silently. No one noticed. Out over the Everglades, the darkness was absolute. There were no city lights, no roads, no landmarks, just a sea of black water and sawgrass. By the time the crew realized they were no longer level, they had dropped nearly 300 feet. Stockstill's voice cut through the calm. "We did something to the altitude," he said almost casually. "What?" Loft asked, leaning forward. "We're still at 2,000, right?" But they weren't. Seconds later, the altimeter needle spun downward. The ground proximity warning horn screamed, "Hey, what's happening here?" Loft shouted. The jet roared into the swamp at over 220 miles per hour. The sound was like a bomb tearing the night apart. Metal shrieking, engines disintegrating, the fuselage breaking apart like paper. Then came silence. Of the 176 aboard, 101 were dead within moments. The rest were scattered in the black water, clinging to floating wreckage under a moonless sky. Captain Loft did not survive. Neither did Stockstill. Donald Repo, gravely injured, was pulled from the wreckage but died the next day. The Everglades swallowed the jet piece by piece. In the days that followed, investigators waded into the swamp retrieving bodies and aircraft parts under a haze of mosquitoes and grief. But they also salvaged something else: the Lockheed's engines, galley components, and other usable parts, which were quietly refurbished and installed in other aircraft in Eastern Airlines' fleet. And that is where the story should have ended. But it didn't. Months later, reports began to surface. Strange, persistent, impossible reports. Flight attendants whispered about seeing a tall man standing silently in the forward galley of a TriStar, only for him to vanish before their eyes. Pilots swore they had seen Repo sitting in the cockpit jump seat, his ghostly face calm, sometimes even smiling, as if to reassure them. At first, Eastern Airlines dismissed it all as nonsense, rumors, imagination, post-traumatic stress. The company had no interest in ghost stories, but the stories didn't stop. Some grew more chilling. One captain swore that during a pre-flight check, a man in uniform appeared, warned him about a potential malfunction, and disappeared. When maintenance checked, they found the very fault he had warned about. The man matched the description of Donald Repo. Soon, a quiet panic rippled through Eastern's crews. Some refused to fly the aircraft that carried salvaged parts from Flight 401. And so the haunting began. But to understand it, to truly feel the weight of what happened, we must return to the swamp, to that night, to the screams that faded into silence, and to the dark water that seemed to hold on to something far more than twisted metal. Because the Everglades never really let go, and neither did they.
The first time Beverly saw him, she thought he was just another deadheading pilot. It was early spring of 1973, and Flight 903 was boarding at JFK, bound for Atlanta. Beverly, a senior flight attendant with 10 years' experience, was performing her usual galley check when she noticed the man standing near the forward service door. He was tall, clean-cut, wearing the old Eastern Airlines uniform. His face was pale, but not unnaturally so. It was more the stillness about him that made her hesitate. "Can I help you, Captain?" she asked. The man didn't answer. He just looked at her for a moment as though weighing something and then, impossibly, dissolved into the air like smoke. Beverly froze. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply stood there as the passengers began to board, her hand gripping the edge of the galley counter so hard her knuckles turned white. Later, in the crew lounge, she told no one. What would she say? That she saw a ghost in uniform. That she recognized him from a photograph in a newspaper months ago. Captain Robert Loft, the man who had died in the Everglades. No one would believe her, but Beverly was not the last to see him. Over the next weeks, the reports multiplied. A mechanic at Miami Maintenance swore he saw a man inspecting the landing gear during a routine check. When he approached to speak to him, the man looked up, nodded once, and disappeared. 2 flight attendants on a flight from Tampa to New York said they saw someone in the cockpit jump seat just before takeoff. They assumed he was deadheading crew until the captain came back to the cabin to ask why they were screaming. When they described him, his narrow face, his dark hair, the calm set of his jaw, the captain went pale. "That's Repo," he said quietly. And then, more disturbing still, the ghost began to speak. It happened to Captain Marshall one humid night in June. Flight 611 was at cruising altitude, smooth air, autopilot engaged. Marshall was reviewing his flight plan when he heard a voice. Low, calm, right behind him. "Check the starboard engine." Marshall whipped around. There was a man in the cockpit. No one had opened the door. No one had entered. But there he was, standing in the narrow space just behind the engineer's panel, hands clasped behind his back like he belonged there. Marshall recognized him instantly, not from personal acquaintance, but from the crash report photographs. "Repo," Marshall whispered. The ghost didn't speak again. He just stared at the engine gauges, then back at Marshall. The captain's hands shook as he reached for the intercom and called maintenance control. They diverted to Jacksonville. When ground crews checked the starboard engine, they found a fuel leak that could have led to a catastrophic fire. Eastern Airlines filed no official report, but word spread through the crew grapevine like wildfire. Not all encounters were so benevolent. Flight attendants began reporting strange sounds in the galley, footsteps when no one was there, the metallic clank of latches opening and closing on their own. Some swore they heard muffled voices whispering in the empty cabin during cruise. One night, on a late flight from Newark, a young stewardess named Carla was preparing coffee when the hot water dispenser suddenly erupted, scalding her arm. She yelped in pain and looked up. And there he was again, Captain Loft, standing silently in the galley, his expression unreadable. "Why are you here?" she whispered, but he only faded away, leaving her shaking, the smell of burned skin filling the air. Psychologists were brought in to interview crew members. Stress, they said. Survivors' guilt, collective trauma. But the sightings continued. Soon, passengers began to experience them too. A businessman on Flight 318 reported that a man sat next to him during boarding, polite, quiet, wearing a captain's cap. When the plane pushed back, the seat was empty. An entire crew reported seeing Repo's face reflected in the oven door of the galley. It stayed there for several seconds before vanishing. There were even rumors of disembodied hands seen adjusting switches in the cockpit, as if finishing a checklist no one had started. Eastern tried to keep it quiet. Flight attendants were warned not to discuss sightings with passengers. Mechanics were told not to talk to the press, but word leaked anyway. Miami newspapers ran headlines about ghosts in the sky. Passengers began requesting not to be booked on certain aircraft, particularly those known to have parts salvaged from Flight 401. Fear spread through the ranks. Some flight attendants refused to work flights on those planes. A few even quit, yet there were others who felt strangely comforted by the apparitions. "They're looking out for us," Beverly told one of her colleagues after another sighting. "They're not here to hurt anyone. They're here to make sure it doesn't happen again." But not everyone agreed. Some said the ghosts were restless because they had not found peace, that they were trapped, forever reliving the night they died. And as summer bled into autumn, the encounters became more intense, more physical. Lights flickered on and off during pre-flight checks. Instruments briefly failed, then returned to normal. Galley carts rolled on their own in perfectly level flight. And then came the night of Flight 903. It was a stormy night. Lightning flashed over the Everglades as the TriStar climbed through 15,000 feet. The cockpit was quiet, and until a scream erupted from the forward galley. Beverly, now senior flight attendant on this flight, ran forward. Carla was pressed against the galley wall, her face white with terror. "He was right here," she said, pointing to the floor. "Who?" Beverly demanded. "Repo," Carla whispered. He said, "Watch the hydraulics." Beverly's stomach twisted. She ran to the cockpit and relayed the message. The captain checked his gauges. Everything was normal at first. Then 10 minutes later, the number 3 hydraulic pressure began to drop. They diverted, landed safely. When mechanics inspected the system, they found a leak that could have led to complete hydraulic failure, loss of control, had they continued. By now, even the skeptics were shaken. These were not random hallucinations. They were warnings, but why? Why would the dead keep returning again and again, haunting the living? Were they trying to protect their fellow aviators? Or were they simply bound to the steel and wires of the aircraft that had killed them, unable to let go? The line between guardian angel and restless ghost was beginning to blur, and for Beverly and for Eastern Airlines, the haunting was far from over, because the Everglades never forgot, and the sky was beginning to remember. By late 1973, Eastern Airlines was no longer in quiet denial, at least not among its crews. The haunting of Flight 401 had become the airline's worst-kept secret. Mechanics spoke in hushed tones as they worked on TriStars that carried salvaged parts from the crash. Pilots exchanged glances when the cockpit door shut, unspoken fear hanging between them like turbulence they couldn't climb above. And yet, the flights continued. For Beverly, the sightings had shifted from shocking to strangely familiar. She no longer froze when she saw Captain Loft in the forward galley. She simply acknowledged him silently, as one would nod to a coworker in the hall. But the atmosphere aboard those planes was changing. It was no longer just quiet warnings or reassuring presences. Something darker was building, as though the very air inside the cabin had grown heavier. The night of November 13th began with unease. Flight 401's sister ship, Aircraft 318 was scheduled for a red-eye from Miami to New York. Beverly was on duty again, along with Carla, who had reluctantly returned to flying after months of ground assignments. The crew briefing had been tense. The captain, an older man named John Whitaker, had looked at them sternly before departure. "Let's get through this flight without any ghost stories," he said. "We've had enough jumpy passengers lately." Carla had forced a smile, but her hands trembled as she tied her scarf. The first sign came just after takeoff. Beverly was in the galley when the overhead lights flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. "Not again," Carla muttered under her breath. Beverly stepped into the aisle, scanning the empty first-class cabin. The passengers were still settling in, oblivious. But Beverly felt it, that prickle on the back of her neck that meant they were not alone. She turned back toward the galley and froze. There, reflected in the stainless steel oven door, was a face. It was Repo. But this time, his expression was not calm. His eyes were wide, almost frantic, his mouth moving silently as if shouting against an invisible barrier. Beverly gasped and stumbled back, slamming into Carla. When she looked again, the reflection was gone. In the cockpit, things were not going smoothly either. At 29,000 feet, The autopilot disengaged without warning. "What the hell?" Captain Whitaker barked, wrestling the controls back. The flight engineer checked the panel. "No mechanical fault," he said. Then a cold wind swept through the cockpit, impossible in a pressurized, climate-controlled cabin. And with it came a faint voice, as though carried on static. "Check. Elevator. Linkage. All 3 men froze. Did you hear that?" The first officer whispered. Whitaker swallowed hard. "Yes." The engineer's hands shook as he inspected the controls. "Sir, we've got partial binding on the elevator servo. We could have lost pitch authority." Whitaker didn't answer. He just glanced at the jump seat. It was empty, but they all knew who had been there. By the time the aircraft leveled off, the atmosphere in the cabin had grown oppressive. Passengers complained of sudden chills, of seatbelt signs flickering even when switched off, of overhead bins rattling as though someone invisible was opening and closing them. In row 7, a child began crying uncontrollably, pointing toward the galley and saying over and over again, "The man's on fire." Beverly felt her stomach knot. Repo had suffered severe burns in the crash, burns that had contributed to his death. She tried to calm the child, but before she could speak, a loud bang echoed from the forward cargo hold. The aircraft jolted. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Screams filled the cabin. In the cockpit, alarms blared. Cargo door pressure fluctuating. Whitaker ordered an emergency descent. As they dropped through 10,000 feet, a sudden calm swept over the aircraft, and there, in the narrow space between the cockpit door and the engineer's panel, stood Captain Loft. He looked as solid as any of them, his cap perfectly in place, his face grave but calm. "You'll be all right," he said, his voice clear and steady. Then he was gone. Moments later, the cargo pressure warning ceased. When they landed in Jacksonville, maintenance crews could find no evidence of malfunction. That night was the turning point. The crew filed a confidential report, not to the airline, but to a private investigator who had been compiling stories of Flight 401's ghosts for months. Word spread quickly. More reports flooded in from crews all over the country. A captain swore he saw Repo physically push his hand back from a throttle during takeoff, preventing an overboost. A flight attendant claimed she heard Loft's voice over the PA system, even though the microphone was dead. A passenger took a Polaroid of the empty cockpit before boarding and found, when it developed, the faint outline of 2 men in Eastern Airlines caps sitting in the seats. For Beverly, the haunting became personal one night when she was dead heading home on an empty ferry flight. She was sitting alone in first class, half asleep when she heard footsteps coming down the aisle. She opened her eyes and saw Repo standing there, his form faintly translucent as though lit from within. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at her with such sadness that her throat closed. "Why?" she whispered. This time he answered, "Because no one listened." And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The seatbelt sign dinged. Beverly wept quietly for the rest of the flight. By the winter of 1973, Eastern Airlines quietly began removing salvaged parts from the TriStars, but it was too late. The haunting had taken root, not just in the metal and wires of the aircraft, but in the minds of every pilot, every flight attendant, every mechanic who had ever flown those skies. The line between living and dead had thinned to nothing, and the ghosts of Flight 401 were not done yet, because the Everglades still whispered at night, and somewhere in the dark, 2 men still waited, watching the skies, refusing to let go.
By 1974, the airline thought the problem was solved. The salvaged parts had been quietly removed, scrapped, or reassigned. Engineers swore no TriStar flying Eastern's colors still carried a piece of Flight 401, and yet the reports kept coming. Beverly knew this would happen. She could feel it in her bones. This was never about the parts. This was never just about metal. It was about memory. One late winter night, she found herself rostered for another red-eye, Miami to Atlanta, Flight 423. The flight was lightly booked, barely half full. Outside, the tarmac shimmered with wet reflections of sodium lights. Low clouds scudded overhead, thick as wet wool. As Beverly performed her safety checks, she felt it again. That weight in the air, the subtle shift in temperature. "Are you all right?" Carla asked, watching her. Beverly hesitated. "They're here." Carla said nothing. She didn't have to. Takeoff was smooth, almost unnervingly so. The TriStar climbed into the cloud layer, swallowed by darkness. At 25,000 feet, turbulence began, gentle at first, then more severe. The seatbelt sign chimed, passengers muttered nervously, and then, without warning, the lights went out. Total darkness. The aircraft shuddered. From somewhere deep in the fuselage came a sound like tearing metal, a scream that seemed too human to be mechanical. Beverly's breath caught, and then she saw him. Standing at the forward bulkhead, illuminated by some light that was not of this world, was Captain Loft. But he was different now, not just calm or stern. There was sorrow in his face, a deep and endless grief. "You're off course," he said simply. The cockpit door flew open before Beverly could react. Inside, the flight deck was chaos, alarms flashing, altimeter unwinding. The first officer fought the controls. "We're in a bank," he shouted. But the strange thing was that the instruments disagreed. Some showed level flight, others a deadly roll to the right. And then, over the shriek of warnings, came another voice. "Trim left." Now, the engineer spun around and saw Repo, sitting calmly in the jump seat, hands folded. The first officer hesitated, sweat running down his temple. "Do it," Beverly screamed from the doorway, though she had no idea why. He obeyed. The aircraft lurched violently, then leveled. The lights flickered back on. When they checked the instruments, they discovered the artificial horizon had malfunctioned. Without the ghostly intervention, they might have entered a fatal spiral, but there was something else. Something no one spoke of until much later. The cockpit voice recorder, when played back, captured not only the alarms but two additional voices that did not belong to any living crew member. One said, very distinctly, "Not this time." The other, "Let's take them home." The flight landed safely in Atlanta, but Beverly knew she had been changed forever. That night in the hotel room, she couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, staring out at the rain-washed tarmac, and for a moment, she thought she saw them again. Two figures standing side by side under a distant light pole. They raised their hands, almost in a salute, and then they were gone. Months turned to years. Beverly left Eastern eventually, moved inland, took a job training new flight attendants, but she never forgot. Every time she heard the distant roar of a jet overhead, she thought of them, Loft and Repo still out there, still flying their endless circuit over the Everglades. Sometimes, late at night, she dreamed of sitting in the cockpit jump seat, staring out at a night sky full of stars. She could feel the plane banking gently, the hum of the engines deep and steady. And in the dream, she was not afraid, because she was not alone. Today, long after Eastern Airlines ceased to exist, after the TriStars were retired and scrapped, pilots still tell the story of Flight 401. They speak of a patch of Everglades where strange lights appear on moonless nights. They tell of radios picking up phantom voices, whispering checklists no one requested. And they say that sometimes, and when the sky is very still, a shadow passes over the cockpit windshield, like a man leaning forward to look at the instruments, a man who is no longer supposed to be there. Beverly is old now, her hair silver, her hands lined with time, but she still flies, in her dreams, in her memories, and sometimes when the wind howls at night, she swears she hears them both. Check gear down, watch your hydraulics, guardians of the sky. Not gone, never gone, and the Everglades still remembers. Because the dead, once bound to steel and sky, do not simply vanish, they wait, they watch, and somewhere even now on some dark and lonely night flight, they are still flying, keeping the living company at 30,000 feet. This ending leaves a chill, suggesting that Loft and Repo spirits have transcended the parts, the plane, even the airline itself, becoming eternal watchers in the night sky.